Central bankers in Frankfurt and London have been very active lately, and ostensibly it's because of the re-lockdowns. But might there be other reasons? What can we infer from this? Will central bankers in Washington and Tokyo follow suit? These are some of the ideas that you address in your next article. And you ask, might the global economy respond positively to this, or is it all a big nothing burger? And so we're going to talk about an article that you posted today, the 6th of November, at Real Clear Markets, and it's called "In 2020, Central Bankers Everywhere Are Being Exposed." A day before that, Britain, the Bank of England, announced that they were going to introduce another 150 billion pounds in QE, bringing the total for this year to 450 billion pounds. And they said it was, quote, to help the economy. The Evening Standard said that this QE is to boost lending and, quote, it gives banks the confidence to keep lending to businesses and households. How about the European technocrats across the channel? How are they doing? Is this happening there as well?
Yeah, I mean, the QE is going everywhere at the moment because central bankers don't do anything else, and they don't really know what else to do. Because by and large, we're in a real economic mess, and their job is to convince you that, yes, we're in a mess, but don't worry about it. We've got everything in the future covered. Whatever bad, unemployment, whatever nastiness you might see or experience right now, it's all going to go away very soon. And QE is the way it's going to all go away. It's going to guarantee you that we're going to have this inflationary future. And given where we are now, inflation sounds really, really good because it's the opposite of the depressionary deflation that we're experiencing at the moment.
That's right. So the inflation is a good kind of inflation that's generated by money creation and not the kind of inflation that we all despise, the one that, our prices are going up. That's the inflation central bankers are going for, the money supply increasing, and then economic activity increasing as well. Well, what do the measures say, Jeff? What are we seeing in consumer prices? What are we seeing in sovereign bond yields over there in Europe?
Well, it's the same divergence, right? I mean, you have central bankers creating bank reserves as the byproduct of all their bond buying, which is supposed to raise inflation expectations because people believe that central bankers are printing money when they're just printing useless bank reserves. So you have, for example, the European Central Bank, which has created somewhere around 3.2 trillion now in bank reserves and their deposit in the current account. And there's actually others dispersed to the national central banks. But in the main two accounts, there's, I think, 3.2 trillion euros, which is a massive increase over the last several months since March, because the European Central Bank has not only done QE, a new QE, they also had the QE ongoing from last year, and then they raised the new QE, the PUPP, whatever it is now, again over the summer. So the European Central Bank is winning the race toward pretend debasement, and yet what we see of inflation in Europe, in the statistics the Eurostat just put out recently, is that inflation in Europe is negative. It's prices are actually falling in the aggregate. Even if when you take away oil and food prices, for example, the core rate in Europe is almost zero, which is a record low, and it's been almost zero for 2 straight months. So there's no inflation in Europe, and there's nothing in Europe. There's nothing going on except the increase in the European Central Bank's balance sheet. So what we would expect after so many months and so much of this QE activity taking place is we would at least expect to see signs of inflation, right? Some kind of something that would point us in the direction of, hey, this stuff is actually working. But yet what we see is that, no, the central bank does a lot of stuff and then it doesn't really do anything in the real economy, which is not the first time we've seen this.
And Jeff, it's not just those measures that you mentioned. There are other measures that also corroborate the no inflation, no money supply being created by central banks. Industrial commodities like oil, swap spreads, Treasury inflation-protected securities. But, Jeff, there is a gigantic fly in the bowl of soup, this deflationary bowl of soup. It's a horse-sized fly. It looks like a little bird, and it's the US Treasury nominal yield. that one is diverging from, let's say, German bunds. Maybe there is inflation on the horizon somewhere.
Yeah, and that's a big one, right? Because
It's
the
huge.
nominal treasury yield has been, yeah, absolutely. That's not one that you can just, that's just a treasury market. No, and not only that, the U.S. Treasury yields, nominal yields, and German bond yields, or Schatz yields, or bubbles, whatever it is, on the U.S. curve and the German curve, almost always trade in near lockstep. On a day-to-day, they're moving in the same direction. They're moving in the same trends. You can almost line them up and almost perfectly where these markets move in tandem. Yet since August 27th, they've diverged, and noticeably diverged. The German market is going, the German yields are sinking back down toward record lows, while U.S. Treasury nominal yields have been leaking a little bit higher and higher and higher. And it's sort of a noticeable divergence where you're saying, okay, something must have changed. But what has changed, right? Because outside of nominal Treasury yields, you go to inflation expectations or swap spreads, nothing has changed. There's not like inflation expectations in the Treasury market, the TIPS market, are rising. They're not. In fact, they're flat to lower since August. So it's just nominal Treasury yields that are going higher at the long end, diverging from German bonds. And it's a curious sort of thing that grabs your attention.
But because you love this stuff, Jeff, admit it, you love it. You remembered that there was another moment just like this, reasonably similar, in 2018, early 2018, when we saw this divergence. And back before we had the lovely Miss Lagarde at the head of the European Central Bank, we had the even lovelier Mr. Who was in charge, and what did he say in 2018 regarding this moment in time when we saw the divergence? The lovely Mario Draghi.
Mario, we've seen all of this stuff before, right? The bond market, it's not our first go around with all the Q. And it was, just 2.5 years ago, we went through the same thing. German bond yields sank throughout the middle of 2018, while the U.S. Treasury nominal yields rose modestly. And then the narrative was exactly the same, right? The Europeans were still doing QE at that time, and they were saying that it was being successful and that inflation was going to accelerate and economic growth throughout Europe was going to accelerate. And yet, already in January of 2018, that was already being undone by what we call Eurodollar number 4, which was the fourth Eurodollar episode. So you already had Germany contracting, you already had inflation falling apart, but yet here was Mario Draghi in January of 2018 saying, we believe that inflation is going to go up to our target and stay there because we believe that inflation is going to go up to our target and stay there. No, by the way, we don't have a single bit of evidence for our theory. That's what he said, and that was supposed to, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that's what he basically was saying, is that, look, our models say that inflation is going to rise, so we believe that inflation is going to rise, when the bond market, the dollar, and all sorts of other indications were saying, it's already over, man. The party's done. And so the German bond market started to trade as it always does, which is deflationary, lower yields, while in America, the Treasury yields kept rising because, well, maybe it was plausible that this was just a Germany or European problem, and that America would decouple from Europe and escape that. And that Jay Powell's very similar, if not the same inflation fantasy as Mario Draghi's, maybe Jay's would work out where Mario's wouldn't. And so that was the divergence through the middle of 2018 where Germany was, yeah, we can see this is not going well, where in America it seemed like, okay, maybe Jay's fiction is at least somewhat plausible still.
And yes, as you said, you were paraphrasing Mario Draghi, and I encourage listeners to read the article because you quote him, and in a space of 2 sentences, he says, strong, ongoing, increasing regarding the economy, and in the very next sentence, muted, not showing convincing signs, unsustained upward trend. So it's a great quote there. And Jeff, I'm going to quote you here, and then we're going to transition to the idea behind all this is that central bankers are doing all this activity to create money supply, but we're not seeing any evidence of it. And I just wanted to quote you on this because this is a really good summary. So, despite years of promises, trillions of QEs, statistical calculations, forecasts, publications, speeches, uniform reporting in all the financial media, there would be no inflation on either side of the Atlantic. You're talking about 2018, but here we are in 2020. If you want to say anything, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll segue to the idea of inflation being a monetary phenomenon.
Yeah, well, what we're really talking about, we're not really talking about inflation specific, but inflation as a symptom or a byproduct of what we all want, which is legitimate, sustained economic growth, which comes about because the monetary system is behaving in the way it's supposed to, and allowing that legitimate, sustained economic growth to happen and maintain itself. So the lack of inflation isn't really about consumer prices; it's about, again, what we see in the bond market with low yields, tight money, the interest rate fallacy, all of those things. And what we're talking about is essentially money that nobody pays attention to, not even central bankers, because they don't really know anything about the global Eurodollar system. And what these bond market signals are showing is that, there's problems in the Eurodollar system still, so we shouldn't expect inflation, which means we really shouldn't expect growth. And in terms of any divergence between the US and Europe, we shouldn't expect decoupling either, because time and time again, what we see is that when something starts to go wrong, it starts to go wrong for everyone. It's just not all at once. So in 2018, it was Europe and Japan and China that got hit first, and then the US came along about 8-9 months later. And so 2019 was once again synchronized, except no longer in globally synchronized growth, but as a globally synchronized downturn. And so we have to, if we're thinking ahead of 2020 to 2021, you've got, again, the German bond market signaling trouble ahead. You've got the US Treasury market sort of signaling maybe not so much, but that's a separate issue. That's just a bunch of Treasury shorts who are betting on Jay Powell for God knows why. But anyway, whatever the divergence is, do we expect that decoupling finally happens for the first time in 13 years? Or are we just going to repeat the same pattern over and over again, which is lower rates, no inflation, no economic growth, no recovery, all these same things that we've seen ever since 2008 and 2009?
Jeff, who may disagree with you regarding the connection between money supply and that positive inflation that you were just describing is Stephanie Kelton, the professor most well known and most associated with modern monetary theory. And she was recently on Eric Townsend's program on Macro Voices. It was a great show. I loved it because she was forthright in all her answers. And she said specifically, she was asked, well, what about inflation if you print this money? And she said she dismissed Copernicus, which we discussed recently. She dismissed Friedman and Greenspan, who you quote in this article, that there's a connection between inflation and money supply. And as an example, she said, look at all this QE money we've created. There's no inflation. I'm throwing red meat to you, Jeff. I know.
That is a softball.
Anyways, that's what she said. You reference Mr. Greenspan in here. And
that's modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory is, look, the central bankers screwed up. They have no idea what they're doing. We can do it better. But we're going to do the same thing, which is not pay attention to the monetary system. Does that sound legitimate to you? I mean, look, history has shown conclusively that money and inflation are intricately linked, maybe not in the short run, but over time. And yet, central bankers doing QE, which she assumes is money printing, and therefore says, well, if the central bank prints money and we don't get inflation, then why can't the government print money and not get inflation? And they don't stop to think that maybe you're not printing money, or you don't even know what the hell money is. Maybe that's the error that central banks have made. And oh, by the way, Miss Professor, have you even read what the central bankers have been saying for the last 50 years? Because they tell you, they admit to you, if you actually listen to what they're saying, we don't have a goddamn clue about what's going on in the monetary system. That's really the point here. And again, modern monetary theory, there's nothing modern about it. And there's no money in the theory, just like there's no money in central bank monetary policy. And that's the problem. So if modern monetary theory intends to be the successor to the current system or the current way of doing things, I would advise that they start listening or looking or doing something monetary rather than just throwing a bunch of stuff up on a classroom blackboard and saying, yeah, that'll work, because that's what central bankers have been doing for the last 50 years, and it hasn't worked for them.
It was my takeaway from that brief interview, admittedly, and I haven't read her book, admittedly, so There's a lot of room for my being wrong here, but it was my understanding that that Eurodollar system does not exist in Stephanie Kelton's understanding of money supply. Jeff, you mentioned it very briefly. This is going to be the last part we're going to talk about. If you wanted to, the treasuries are diverging because there are many speculators betting against them. Do you want to say anything about that? If not, we'll move on.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is that it's basically just speculators. It's leverage money. With the rest of the institutional part of the market is saying, look, we'll take your money because if you want to short treasuries based on what Jay Powell's doing, you go ahead. We've seen this movie many times before. But yet the size of the short position has grown absolutely historically huge. So, and you know, it makes sense. If you're believing in reflation, that you believe in the economy's rebounding, even if you don't even have to believe in Jay Powell's inflation, but you just believe things are getting better, where are you going to make the most money? The reflation trade is already played out in the stock market. And if you look at the long end of the bond market, you think, well, prices there are near historic highs. Why not short that part of the marketplace? I just think that, you know, they might do better to pay attention to Japan and other instruments and look at what happens when central bankers don't know what they're doing. And if you're really betting on them to get it right, and oh, by the way, all the rest of the markets are telling you you're wrong, maybe you shouldn't double and quadruple down on these shorts because let's face it, despite the fact that they've gone historically short, these leverage money speculators, the long bonds have not moved very much at all. Very little. So, you know, it's sort of a telling sign that, you know, if that's the only thing that you're using to bet against the market, you might want to look around at everything else.
Jeff, let me just understand, because this is the most important market there is. So the leverage money speculators is one crowd, but the other crowd, is that the crowd that we should be listening to? Are those who is the other crowd taking the other position? Are they more credible?
Well, if you look at it over the long run, yeah, because they're the institutions who actually operate the Eurodollar system and create the money, create the balance sheet capacity to let that stuff go. If they're jumping on the short side of the train because they think, hey, things are going to be great and we're going to be expanding our balance sheets, that's when you would pay attention to. Mm-hmm. But if it's just people out there betting on Jay Powell, and you can look at the short speculative position, it's been building since June of 2019, which June of 2019 basically was when Powell admitted they're flipping from rate hikes to rate cuts. And then it got bigger after March when this latest round of QEs were introduced in the US and, of course, all across. And they got even bigger still since late August when everything else changed to more deflationary. And what happened in late August? Late August was when Jay Powell got into Jackson Hole, or at least on some computer screen at Jackson Hole, and said, we're going to do average inflation target. We're going to let inflation run hot. So the central bank is giving you, if you believe in this kind of thing, they're giving you cues to go short the treasury market. But if you go back to June 2019, are treasury prices much lower than they were a year and a half ago? No, they're much higher. So if you've been short the treasury market since June of 2019, as so many people obviously in the leverage money speculator class has, the other side of that, the institutions who are owning it and using it as collateral, are saying thank you for the additional premium in addition to the treasury prices going through the roof.